Think Forward. Think Research Channel.
Now it's my privilege to introduce Dr. Paul Zak, who has been in Italy for the past few days presenting a paper and has been flying long hours to be here with us today, so we're very happy for that. Dr. Zak has a PhD in economics from the University of Pennsylvania, a BA in mathematics, and a BA in economics from San Diego State, and I was kind of excited to see on his CV that he was first in his class in both of those. He's had a fellowship in functional magnetic resonance imaging from Mass General and a fellowship in experimental economics from the University of Arizona. At the current time, he's director of a Center for Neuroeconomics Studies at Claremont Graduate University. He's associate professor of economics at the same university, and he is an adjunct professor here at Loma Linda in neurology. He is doing research that integrates neuroscience and economics into a new discipline called neuroeconomics. He's the associate editor of two journals, the Journal of Economics, Behavior and Organization, and the Journal of Bioeconomics. He's edited 4 books, one of which is the Critical Readings in Neuroeconomics, and he's published over 40 articles in the areas of neuroscience, biology, institutional economics, political economy, and monetary economics. He's been a part of 22 funded grants, and he's spoken at numerous conferences and given presentations and seminars. Now, I became acquainted with Dr. Zak from a poster where he was speaking on the neurobiology of trust and has been interested in the neurobiology of attachment as well. So as you can see, he's done a lot of different things. I attended the opening of his center at Claremont, and he did a marvelous job of having a great symposium in connection with that opening of that center. Got to meet his graduate students and become acquainted with the interesting projects that he's working with them on. So it's with lots of pleasure that I introduce you today to this group. Dr. Paul Zak.
Thank you very much. Nice to see so many people here, and as well as so many friends. I'm very interested in the origins of good behavior, which as an economist drives a lot of what we see in the market. Through this, I got interested in whether, quote, good behavior has a religious basis. So what I want to do today is present a brief thesis to you regarding potential origins for belief in God, and give you some evidence from my laboratory from the last couple of years that supports this thesis indirectly. And if I have time, I'll tell you about the current experiments we're running that seek to offer direct support for it. And because we're short on time, I want to give you the thesis now up front before I can support it. So here's the thesis. Mammals have a very strong attachment system. And indeed, it's attachment to offspring that differentiates mammals from other animal species. And this system is particularly strong in humans. We attach to our children, we attach to spouses, we attach to other people, we call friends, sometimes we even attach to other animals we call pets. And this attachment system may also mediate our attachment to God. And the reason I think that is that belief in God requires trust. You can say, well, I believe in this or that, but if you behave in a way in which, in a well-defined sense, which I will show you in my talk, in which you change your life because you trust that God will direct your life, then the mechanisms that we found that mediate trust between individuals may in fact mediate trust in God. If this is the case, you could interpret this as saying the human brain has particular features which may make us likely to believe in God and trust in God. I'll leave it to your own imagination to think of where those features came from. I don't have any evidence to say one way or another, but I think the thesis is testable and supportable, and I want to give you a little evidence for that today. So that's where we're going, and I'll try to stop promptly on time and take questions. So when we decide who we trust, we use lots of different cues. We use facial features, we use reputation, we ask our friends, and when we do this, we generally do a pretty good job. When you meet someone new, you can identify who you might trust or who you don't trust. And yet there are people who work very hard to gain our trust who are not. The gentleman on the near the top of the glasses is the BTK killer, who was an elder in his church, taught in the Boy Scouts, worked very hard to be a trustworthy person, and by all accounts was an evil and sadistic human being. Next to him is John Wayne Gacy, played a clown in children's parties. So if we navigate the world with strangers around us, which most of us do, we have to have something in our heads that tell us, here's a person we trust and here's a person we don't trust. We need to do that rather quickly to decide who we want to be around for safety reasons. So this requires that we make decisions on how we behave with strangers. President Madison suggested that we need to be careful almost all the time. People have this high degree of depravity, and if we're not on our guard, then we'll be taken advantage of. On the other hand, one of my favorite plays by Tennessee Williams, the character Blanche Dubois suggests that we are always asking for the kindness of strangers. I was, as Dr. Grover said, I was in Italy the last couple of days, and many, many strangers were kind to me, since I don't speak Italian. Why would they do this? From a biological perspective, it's not clear at all why you would help someone that you do not share genes with. They cannot, they're helping me, cost them resources, and does not help their survival or reproductive success. Interesting, a large number of people continue to believe in God. This is survey data done by the BBC recently for a variety of countries that identify belief in God. Interestingly, on the way home yesterday from Italy, I was sitting next to one of the archbishops from Nigeria. In this graph, that has 100% penetration of Christians. Very interesting. And I said, when I met this gentleman who was sitting next to me, I said, well, you must be the archbishop of Nigeria. He said, oh, no, I'm one of 6 or 7. Wow, that's a big place. So we have not only Western culture, but Eastern cultures, African cultures that have high degree belief in God. And throughout human history, 99+% of human beings have believed in a God or gods. So what's the basis for that? Here's some survey data that identifies people who responded yes to the question, do you trust other people in your country? So I'm going to make a connection here between trust in other people and trust or belief in God. If you look at the top left corner, you'll see that in Norway, Sweden, Denmark, about 2/3 of the people say, people in my country are trustworthy. The U.S. is in the middle, around 45%. And the lower right-hand corner, you see Brazil, Peru, and the Philippines, and less than 5% of people in those countries say, yes, people in my country are trustworthy. Interestingly, religion appears to increase the amount of trust in a country. This graph is difficult to read, but the 3 arrows in the graph show that if you're raised religiously, if you're currently religious and actively religious, you are more likely to say that you trust other people. So religiosity and trust may run together. So here's my research approach. And this comes right from the story of the Good Samaritan, whose statue graces the lawn out front. I can let you read that on your own, but I think what's interesting about the story of the Good Samaritan is that not only did the Samaritan help the man who was injured, he left money for the innkeeper to care for him, and indeed said, if I haven't given you enough, I will come back and give you more. Just like in the story of Watergate, if you follow the money, you might get an idea of what people care about. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to follow the money. Okay, so One of the stepping off points is this sort of generalized trust levels across countries, which is very strongly related to poverty. So poor countries are by and large low trust countries. So if we understand trust, my claim is that we might not only understand things like belief in God, we can also help reduce poverty. So trust is a large part of my research agenda, and that's the remaining part of my talk. We'll talk about that. So in particular, we've been very interested in the last couple of years in my laboratory on what are the neural mechanisms that will allow us to determine who to trust and who not to trust. Okay. So I'm going to focus most of my talk, since we're short on time, on that question, and I'm going to leave open as an open question on whether the same mechanism mediates belief in God. And again, if I have time, I'll tell you about some experiments that seek to test that directly that we're running. Okay. So trust is almost a uniquely human behavior. Trust in strangers. Strangers you've never seen before, strangers you don't share any genes with. And if you put subjects in a laboratory and ask them why they trust someone else, they have a difficult time articulating why they do that. So I'm going to give you a task which objectively measures the degree of trust and the degree of reciprocation of that trust by following the money. But the sort of prevailing view in the decision sciences is that decisions are well thought out, they're considered, and if people are making a decision, you should be able to tell people why you're making that particular decision. We don't find that for trust decisions. We find that trusting a stranger is difficult to understand. The basic biology we've uncovered for the neural basis for trust, there goes my water, is that this derives from the first trusting relationship in our lives, which is with our mothers for most of us. It's a very intimate relationship, and it draws on neural mechanisms that are unique to mammals. And these neural mechanisms appear to hold over in our studies of trust between strangers. So let me repeat that to be clear. We have now a large body of evidence suggesting that the same mechanisms that bond mothers to offspring in mammals and in humans, fathers as well to offspring, seem to also mediate our trust in complete strangers, trust in a very tangible way. And this mechanism utilizes an ancient hormone called oxytocin, which is a simple peptide made up of 9 amino acids. And some years ago, I thought perhaps this peptide might mediate trusting between strangers. If it does, and this is going to be an oxytocin story, this is not a surprise for anyone who knows my research. If it does, and I will try to convince you that it does, this is consistent with the inability for subjects in these experiments to articulate why they're making their decisions, because receptors for this peptide centrally are in evolutionarily old areas of the brain associated with emotions and regulation of body states. So this is not kind of a conscious decision you're making, it's kind of a gestalt, it's kind of an emotional sense, a feeling of what to do. Oh, this person was nice to me, oh, isn't that great? And that produces a change in my physiology, which motivates me to behave in a like way. So within monogamous species, which are about 5% of mammals, oxytocin is considered kind of a mediator of what we might call loving relationships. In particular, co-parenting by both males and females of offspring, and the maintenance of monogamous bonds. So for monogamous mammals, if you interrupt the oxytocin system, they lose their pair bonding preference. I also think in humans that oxytocin facilitates empathy. So I'm not empathetic with someone that I don't feel a relationship to or don't feel something about. So I think that oxytocin is one way that humans care about other humans, which is unusual for most animals. We care about strangers in particular. So if you think of gazelles in a herd on the African savanna, if a gazelle falls and breaks its leg, what do the other gazelles do? They bolt, because you've just become lion food. No one's going to help you. But human beings who fall and break an ankle on the sidewalk, almost immediately have many other humans stopping to help them, humans who don't know them, who aren't related to them. And we do that generally at a sense of empathy. Oh, isn't this terrible? This poor person broke their ankle. Look how much pain they're in. I kind of feel that pain. And that seems to be mediated by oxytocin. So what I want to do now is tell you about some experiments we've run, laboratory experiments in which we measure trust directly and have identified the role for oxytocin in mediating trusting decisions. So what we want to do is put experimental subjects in a real laboratory setting that mimics the aspects of trust and belief. And this has to do with allowing yourself to be taken advantage of by another person, allowing control to pass to another person on the hope or belief or trust that that'll be beneficial to you. So you're signaling to them, I'm putting myself in your hands. And I'm doing that because I believe that you understand that I'm doing this because we can both benefit from it. But you need not help me if you don't want to. And we're going to do that in an experiment with an active task without any overt deception, no deception at all, in fact. And we'll do it in a way that's blinded, so that if we do have individuals who are not being so pleasant, who don't feel like sharing, don't feel like reciprocating, they can do that without having a sense that the experimenter is looking over their shoulder, or any other person in the experiment will know who they are. So all the experiments I will show you are in a double-blinded condition. Okay. And as I said before, we'll use money. So here's the kind of social dilemma that we'll put these subjects into. We recruit a bunch of subjects for an experiment, and they'll all get $10 if they show up and agree to spend an hour and a half in a hard chair in a computer lab. And they'll be instructed in this particular task. They'll log into a computer using a random identifier, and then after instructions, again, there's no deception, so we instruct them exactly in what the task is. We say, here's the decision you have to make. The computer will randomly assign you to be either decision maker 1 or decision maker 2, in which you're formed in pairs. And decision maker 1 will get a prompt by computer saying, would you like to send some amount of the $10 you've earned for suffering for an hour and a half in the laboratory to the person you've been matched to? You can send any amount from 0 to 10, and whatever you send, I, the experimenter, will triple in the other person's account. So if you take $8 out of your account, you keep 2, and they're going to have $24 that they got from you, plus the $10 they got for showing up, $34. And then the second person, decision maker 2, will get a prompt saying, hey, person 1 sent you $24. You have a total of 34 in your account. Do you want to send some amount back to him or her? From 0 to 34. Push a number on a computer screen, and that's it. You only do it once. You never see the person. You're paid by a laboratory manager who's not part of the experiment. So this is, I think, a clever way to measure trust and trustworthiness. So within this experimental economics literature, and this task was not invented by me and has been run many, many times and for much larger stakes around the world, the consensus view is that the only reason, if you're decision maker 1, why you would transfer money out of your account to someone else's account is because you're saying, I trust you, I believe in you, I hope that you'll get it, right? We can make the pie grow by 3 times, and I hope that you'll be nice and kind of play ball with me. And then the return transfer from decision maker 2 to decision maker 1 is a measure of trustworthiness or reciprocation. So this is an objective way to measure, I think, the essence of what it is to believe in another human being, which is to make a sacrifice for them. Right? If I believe in you, I'm making a tangible sacrifice to make you better off in the hopes that I also can be made better off. My life will be better, but there's no guarantee of that. I have to sort of take a leap of faith, if you will. Oh, I forgot to tell you, in my experiments, the $10 not only compensates you for sitting in these hard computer chairs for an hour and a half, I'm going to take 4 tubes of blood from your arm as well. So people are literally making their decisions here based on blood money, and $10 motivates undergraduates quite a lot. And perhaps some medical students here as well. Okay, so one choice, there's no communication with the person you're matched with. You're seated far away from them. You're in a partitioned computer station. You cannot see them in any way. All of the decisions are made by computer, and we've synced the times all of these experiments start. Okay. So I'm going to run 2 conditions. One is the standard trust condition, which I just described to you, and the second is a control condition, which uses a very expensive piece of laboratory equipment which is pictured on the screen. This is equipment that I purchased at Walmart for $10, which is a plastic container which I covered with duct tape, and I put in 11 ping pong balls numbered 0 to 10. And these correspond to the choices that decision maker 1 can make in this trust decision. So the animal literature suggests that oxytocin mediates cooperative behaviors when they're intentional. So we want to remove in the control condition the intentional aspect of the transfer by decision maker 1 and see if we don't get the same effect of oxytocin on this decision. So we're going to compare the standard social dilemma that captures trust with this control condition in which I, the experimenter, have removed the decision from decision maker 1. And the reason we use such clunky looking equipment, we could do this by computer easily, is because it's visceral, it's real. I come over to you, I shake this thing up, it's obvious that decision maker 1 is really not making the decision himself or herself, that's being made for them. Okay, here's a picture of the laboratory. Most of these studies were done at UCLA. It's very large, holds 67 people. We never run studies with more than 20 subjects at a time, so subjects are well distributed throughout the laboratory. And where we're standing, kind of behind where this picture is where the blood draw room is. So you make a decision sequentially when we call it your secret number. When you're done, you raise your hand, you're led back to a room to get a blood draw, and you sit back down when you're done. So here's the blood draw room. It has high degree of privacy. This is an actual subject in the blood draw and some of my collaborators in this experiment. Oxytocin had not been studied much in human beings because it was thought as sort of purely OBGYN hormone. It's associated in humans with uterine contractions and milk letdown for breastfeeding. Wasn't considered to have any behavioral effects or very few behavioral effects. And partially is that's very hard to measure. Has a very short half-life of around 3 minutes and degrades very rapidly at room temperature. So we've worked out a set of protocols so that we don't lose the signal. So those involve having you make your trust decision and immediately doing the blood draw, putting the blood on ice, spinning the blood in a refrigerated centrifuge at 4 centigrade, keeping it very cold, putting on dry ice immediately. So those tight protocols have allowed us to get fairly high quality data. Okay, me at work. So what we find in a paper we published last year was that for decision maker 2s who received any intentional signal of trust, so any intentional monetary transfer, the oxytocin levels are about 50% higher than subjects who received a random monetary transfer using the ping pong ball draw, in which the transfers on average were the same amount. So at a first cut, what we're seeing is that when someone sacrifices to make you better off, your brain appears to release oxytocin. So we think we're on the right track. And that's statistically significantly different. Interestingly, when someone intentionally trusts you, you're much more likely to reciprocate, to be trustworthy, than when someone has money taken out of their account and sent to you without a decision. So there's a very high correlation between what decision maker 1s send in the social dilemma and what they are returned, 0.56, and there's statistically no correlation at all between what is returned by decision maker 2s when the ping pong ball determine how much is transferred. So there seems to be a behavioral component as well. And lastly, when we directly relate oxytocin levels to the amount returned, in this case the log of oxytocin levels, we find a very strong relationship. So the logic here, I'm going through this very quickly, I understand, but the logic here is the more someone trusts you, that is, the more you receive as a decision maker 2, the more your brain appears to release oxytocin, and in turn, the more you reciprocate. So in this case, good works beget good works. And I should also say that that also means that the more money you make as a first decision maker. So the more you sacrifice, the more you believe in someone else, the more you get in return. Okay. We measured lots of other hormones that interact with oxytocin, particularly other reproductive hormones like estradiol, progesterone, testosterone, and they don't have much of an effect at all on behavior, as they have no effect on behavior at all, and they have very little relationship between a large number of psychological tests that we gave subjects. So this was not a sense of personality traits driving this. So it wasn't like we just happened to have people who were wonderful, sweet, dear. We had a really kind of normal cross-section of folks. And I should also tell you that basal oxytocin levels in decision maker 1, so decision maker 1s did not receive a social stimulus, were unpredictive of the amount of trust they showed. So what we had here is we had a stimulus that prompted the brain to release oxytocin, which is released in social settings and otherwise is close to zero peripherally. And once we had this stimulus, once someone sacrificed to make you better off, it's then when your brain released oxytocin, and it's then that the behavioral effect was observable. Okay. So there wasn't any evidence of some physiologic type, that there were people who just happened to have, for example, high levels of oxytocin for whatever reason, perhaps genetically, that they behaved indifferently with low levels. It's people who had this particular stimulus, decision maker 2s, who seem to have a large effect on behavior. We do find that about 2% of our subjects are kind of hardcore trust violators. That is, whatever amount of money you send them, they keep just about all of it, or all of it. So we have a technical word for these folks in my lab, which I won't tell you because it's a little bit risque. They're not folks you want to have coffee with, let me say that. So interestingly, if you look in the circle, those are the kind of outliers, and they have extraordinarily high levels of oxytocin. So this suggests to us that there's a particular brain dysfunction, perhaps at the receptor level, in which their brains are producing lots of oxytocin, but they're not really getting the signal behaviorally. So that's an area for further research, but I think it's provocative when we see people who kind of aren't playing ball like everybody else. And psychologically, these people have traits that make them look like sociopaths. So they really don't care about other people. And in fact, the way that we discovered them was a gentleman who was gleeful in his ability to take money from other folks. Okay, so here's some of their personality traits. Okay, so I'll run out of time on this. So what I've shown you so far is this correlational evidence in which there's a strong correlation between the amount someone trusts you, the amount of oxytocin that's released, and your subsequent behavior, trustworthy behavior. But we haven't shown causation. So in a paper we published last year, we sought to show causally that oxytocin was a direct link between trust between individuals by infusing around 200 subjects with 24 IU of oxytocin intranasally. The nose is a nice way to get drugs into the brain, and not surprisingly, subjects in these experiments prefer not to have needles if they can help it. We let the drug load for 15 minutes and had them do 4 rounds of this trust task with different partners each time. We found that trust was 17% higher in decision maker 1s who had received intranasal oxytocin. More tellingly, and that's statistically higher, more tellingly, we more than doubled the number of people who showed maximal trust. So in this graphic, the dark bars are the group that got oxytocin, and the open bars are those who got placebo. So in this was actually run in Switzerland, so the maximal amount of trust you could show would be 12 units. And the proportion that sent all their money to a stranger went from 21% to 45%. Okay, so this looks to us like fairly strong causal evidence that if we increase the amount of oxytocin in your brain, that we can indeed change your behavior regarding trusting another individual. We didn't find that those who were given oxytocin had a difference in mood. They weren't necessarily happier or calmer. Didn't change decision maker 1's beliefs about how much money they would get back. It just seemed to reduce their anxiety of interacting with a stranger. And I think that tells us about the kind of balance and appropriate balance we have between trust and distrust in strangers. We don't want to go through the world kind of gullible and giving things away all the time, nor do we want to go through the world distrusting everybody. So if chronic distrust moves into paranoia, which is a psychiatric disorder. So there's this balance between the effects of trust and distrust. I shall also say that in this experiment, there was no effect on trustworthiness for the reason that should be clear to you all now if you're following my very fast talk, which is there's so much trust in the world anyway in this experiment that decision maker twos, even those who didn't receive oxytocin, their brains released so much oxytocin that presumably most of those oxytocin receptors were bound up anyway, and increasing oxytocin further didn't affect their behavior. So it's very consistent with this endogenous mechanism to promote trust. And I guess I should say one caveat on this, which is, again, we didn't infuse oxytocin in people to either take their money or to, pharmacologically manipulate their behavior, only to prove causally what's going on. So for anyone who sells investment products or life insurance or used cars, this is not going to help you. Did that only because I have a friend in the audience. Okay, so we're currently now looking at the central effects of oxytocin versus the peripheral effects. We have some fairly strong evidence in the MRI on the left panel showing that regions in the brain that are rich in oxytocin receptors, particularly the amygdala, a region of the brain associated with emotions, is strongly active when you trust a stranger versus when you play against a computer who is playing randomly. So there's a human aspect to this that provokes oxytocin release, and that human aspect is in these emotional areas of the brain. We do have some research as well that when someone trusts you, when your brain releases oxytocin, that you are calmer, and this is shown by a greater vagal nerve tone. So we've measured heart rate variability, which is a measure of vagal tone, and showed that when you are trusted, indeed you get a increase in heart rate variability. So the theory there is that under stress, you need to regulate the heart very carefully, and the variability between of the heart is lower. When you're calm and relaxed, you don't need to expend the energy metabolically for the tight regulation of the heart. Okay, so what do we draw from this? There may be a variety of conditions that affect how we develop this system that determines who we trust, who we don't trust, and how much we trust. The environment certainly matters. In these experiments, we have not varied the environment, and we have investigated history of developmental history in these subjects and have not found strong effects. We're currently doing experiments here at Loma Linda that investigate whether the role of childhood abuse or neglect affect the system. So in rodents, there's a very strong effect on development of oxytocin receptors if a rodent is neglected by its mother in the first couple of weeks of life. You get a strong atrophy of regions that should have oxytocin receptors. So there are very few receptors in those regions. The same may be true for individuals. We're currently doing research now explicitly on moral decision making and the role of oxytocin in that, in particular contrasting personal versus impersonal moral decisions. For any of the philosophers in the audience, you'll know about this. We're also looking at the Kohlbergian stages of moral development and the role of oxytocin in particularly the higher stages that involve empathy. And I say we have some preliminary evidence on both those, particularly on moral decisions, that personal moral decisions are mediated by empathy via oxytocin. And we've done this by infusing people with oxytocin and have them make a variety of moral decisions that are both personal or impersonal, as well as neutral decisions. We're also running a project in the next month or so on forgiveness. Forgiveness is actually very important to maintain relationships with other human beings. And I don't have any evidence to show you on that, but I think forgiveness requires empathy as well. So I don't ask for forgiveness from someone that I don't care about. I just don't care about them. So it has to be that I'm asking forgiveness about someone whose sense of me, whose relationship I want to at least maintain at some level. And I should also mention the book by Lee Kirkpatrick, which promotes pretty much the same thesis that I've given you some evidence for here, in which belief in God is an attachment. The only thing he doesn't have is the oxytocin research, because we only published that in the last 2 years. But I hope he wouldn't disagree that this is a possible mechanism through which so many human beings have a belief in God and an afterlife and are willing to give their lives up, that is, to trust that God has a plan for them and that their behavior varies accordingly. So with that, I will thank co-authors, many funders have helped, and also direct you to my website that has many of the scientific papers for download if you absolutely must read more. So with that, I'll leave you with a final thought. And I'd be happy to take some questions. Yes, thank you. I will. So we have a microphone in the center. So anyone has a question, if you maybe queue up at the mic, we could do them. And there was someone who wanted to go back and see something. Was there something here? I can go back wherever I am. Thank you for coming, and I won't be hurt if you need to leave and get to your next appointment. Not a question at all. There's a beautiful microphone here, and we have 10 minutes for questions. Okay. No, because I'm talking about unpublished and speculative work, but you can get the published work up on my website. Yeah, so the question is whether PowerPoints are available, and the question is no, because my co-authors will cut my head off. I did that. Question? There's a mic right behind you if you want to ask a question. Be happy to take one.
Did you see any difference between male and female in your studies?
That's a great question. So the question was whether there's a difference between males and females in our studies. And when we first ran these studies in a smaller sample, we did not find a difference. But we've now run over 300 subjects in this trust protocol with a blood draw to look at endogenous oxytocin release. What we find is that women tend to be less trusting than men do initially. But if they are trusted, that is, if they're decision maker twos, control for how much money they receive, they tend to be much more generous than men do. In a paper we published late last year, we showed this is attributable to oxytocin levels. So we're not only measuring trust in this experiment, we're also measuring distrust. So distrust the amount of money that I do not send to you if you're a decision maker two. So from the subject's perspective, if I'm sending you $0 or $1 or $2, I'm saying to you, I don't know who you are, but I don't really like you, I don't want to trust you, I don't want to play ball with you. What we find for women is that their responses as decision maker two scale up and down quite nicely. The more you send them, the more they return. For men, there's a threshold. If you send men less than about 20% or 25% of the pie, they return 0. And the less you send men, there's a linear relationship between the amount that you don't send a man and his level of dihydrotestosterone. So dihydrotestosterone, the medical students all know what this is a sort of a high-octane version of testosterone. It's associated with all the sort of typical male behaviors and secondary sexual characteristics we see in puberty, vocal cord deepening and hair growth and muscle growth. So the men had this aggressive response. You don't trust me? You're violating the social norm. You're violating the contract, the expectation. And what do I want to do? I want to take you outside and beat you up. So women, we found, don't like being distrusted, but they didn't have this hot physiologic response that men did. And they said, well, it's not so nice, but I'll still return some money to them. So the guys had a different response. So think of men as being testosterone poisoned, as we know. Okay, yes. Time for one or two more questions before you must run. Yes.
We're living in a day of high drug incidence with teenagers. Adults take medication. Any evidence that external medication or drugs interferes with this process?
Wonderful question. We have explored that extensively. Let me say that about half of our subjects have taken illicit drugs in the last couple of weeks. We asked them a number of questions on that. We don't find that illegal drug use has an effect on their oxytocin levels or on their behavior, surprisingly. I would suggest that chronic drug use does. Let me give you a quick piece of evidence to support that. We're doing some work now with criminal psychiatric patients, and we had a woman who was in jail for dealing methamphetamine, was a low-level methamphetamine user, and I asked her to do a little simpler variant of this experiment with me. She's in shackles. She was in jail with a guard there. And I said, here's the experiment, how much would you offer? And immediately she said, half, like that. I said, why? She said, because in the drug world, if you're not a fair dealer, you die. Okay, our undergraduates don't say this, and this is something different. So there's two ways to interpret this. One is that she's been molded by this, by basically 30 years of being a homeless person and supporting herself by dealing drugs, that her environment has carried over. The second is that she's probably used an awful lot of methamphetamine that may have changed her drugs. So in sort of casual drug users, we don't find a relationship, nor in alcohol users, nor in people who have been abused. So about 45 of our subjects at UCLA, 45% have said that they have had, on self-report, have been sexually abused. So I don't think we have enough pathology there, but what we're investigating now is whether this probe, which I think probes both the likelihood of someone having spiritual beliefs as well as their ability to form relationships with other people, may be predictive of outcomes in a number of patient groups. So we see this as a potentially useful probe to understand potential brain dysfunction in areas that allow us to bond to other people. Yeah, thank you. Yes?
I just had one question. I'm still having a little difficulty accepting your concept of trust versus distrust and passing of money. So if you can explain that a bit more. I guess I'm not quite trusting yet of that construct. I would see, passing money around as more of a issue of benevolence or charity and not trust.
Great question.
So please explain how you decided to use this tool to measure that construct.
Right. So charity would be if I took money out of my pocket and gave it to you and we ended that. So that also is a task that we've run as a control. It's unrelated to oxytocin levels. And if I shoot some oxytocin into your brain, it doesn't affect your ability to be charitable. So this task is explicitly other regarding in that I have to use what psychologists call a theory of mind to think, if I'm decision maker 1, I have to think, what would decision maker 2 do if I was sent $5, $10? So it's really about understanding human reciprocation. So generosity or altruism or charity is about me giving and not expecting a return and not wanting a return, giving for giving's sake. This is not that. This is really about understanding that human beings are social creatures and that by and large, most people understand that if you sacrifice to help them, you'll be made better off. So for example, another quick anecdote, and I want to take more questions. I was in the airport in Paris recently and was going to call my wife and said, I'm on the way home, the plane's on time. Didn't at the time had a phone that worked in France. Long story short, I ended up asking a airline employee on an airline I was not flying on for help, and he ended up giving me his calling card and paid for me to call home. So from a biological perspective, he's burning resources to help a stranger he will literally never see. It can't help his reputation. I'm not flying in his airline. He's not going to get a raise. And I felt so good. And remember, this is in Paris. Right? So I think that's about this kind of connectedness we have as human beings, that we are really connected to each other. And if you ask for help and if someone helps you, it kind of makes your day. And I still remember this. Right? It was a year ago. Yes, another question.
I just wondered if you were able to determine what the effect of advancing age is on the ability to trust.
Where's the representative for the NIH when we need them? We put a grant in about 6 months ago to ask that very question. So oxytocin is a reproductive hormone, and most reproductive hormones tend to start declining in middle age. Because oxytocin has not been studied, we don't know that. We do know that in survey data that older people tend to be more trusting than younger people. That'd be inconsistent with the decline of oxytocin, but there are other effects, on the brain with trust. So we actually don't know that answer, but I hope that we'll start answering that question in the next year. Yeah, thank you. Yes, sir.
I found this all fascinating. I wonder if you would philosophically reflect on your findings. Do you think that in the wrong hands, this sort of evidence could be, unfortunately, reductionistic? Along with that, how does this human empathy that it seems like oxytocin promotes, how does that relate to or not relate to prudent judgment in regard to how much to trust, in what situations to trust? I'm wondering if you can reflect on larger parameters that this fascinating research suggests.
Thank you. In fact, I thought you were going to ask to sort of speculate on sort of philosophical or theological implications of this. And since I did have an archbishop next to me on the plane yesterday, I tried this talk out on him, and he was quite skeptical. And so I should have said this in the very beginning of the talk when the room was full, but I'm certainly not trying to measure the effect of God here. I wouldn't know how to do that. And what I hope to do is generate a conversation with people who are interested in this field. And I would love to talk to people more after the talk who really have expertise in the areas of theology and philosophy, who can guide me more on this. So all I can do is measure the sort of physiologic and human behaviors and perhaps speculate on the other.
Sure.
But in terms of prudence, in terms of sort of us going through our daily lives, there are a lot of interesting implications that we're finding. Civilization depends on trust. The hallmark of civilization is living with unrelated others, and that requires the sort of trust detector to live in your brain, which we think we found. So we're constantly battling with, I see Dr. Carr looks like a nice person. I don't know, I had to trust him, even though he's trying to sell me something perhaps, versus, I see someone and I don't get those kind of cues. So I think we're doing this at an unconscious level all the time. Having said that, I think salespeople, and in particular con men, con is for confidence, right? Try to gain our confidence by doing things that draw on our strong empathy evoking mechanisms in the brain. So they tell us about their children, they tell us about the hard luck story, they tell us that they're injured, and you want to believe that, but it won't be true. So to build trust, you can do things like make eye contact, you can have an open body language. We have some unpublished research showing that touch raises oxytocin levels and has a profound effect on trust in this task I showed you. So beware of the salesman who puts his arm around you. So I have answered your question. Do you want to re-ask the question?
I think so. So okay. What I hear you saying is that here I'm giving some new, interesting physiological information, and what we make of it is something else. I mean, this is something new to add to an important discussion having to do with what to do about us humans who do tend to trust, and then when it comes to how that should be exercised, that's another level of this enterprise.
I agree. And let me say that these areas of brains that are active, these old areas, are mediated by in particular frontal regions of the brain, cortical regions. So even when we put people on oxytocin, we don't turn them to automatons. Right? There are people who decide just not to be that trusting, and that's okay. Right? That suggests normal variation within brain function. So the effects of oxytocin are in fact quite mild. On the way home from the airport yesterday, I got a call from the Washington Post asking if oxytocin had been investigated as a tool to interrogate terrorists. And the answer is, even though I've asked the DoD to fund my research, they've declined because the effects are very mild. Right? If I really want to manipulate your mind, I can do that. There's plenty of other drugs I can use to do that. They're powerful. These are really subtle effects. And again, we're doing this to understand, the sort of details, the mechanism through which we are allowed to go through the world and interact with strangers all the time, and not to understand, in particular, how to manipulate the world. Yes, ma'am.
I deeply appreciate your presentation. I'm wondering if you're aware if there has been any research on the oxytocin levels of people in civilians in war zones or in the military that are in war zones.
Thank you. Good question. The answer is no, again, because oxytocin was basically unstudied before we published our work in 2004. But the physiologic mechanisms are well known from the animal research, and high amounts of stress do inhibit the release of oxytocin. So the way to think about this is, if you're in survival mode, if you're trying to get through the next 2 hours, the first thing you think about is getting me out of this, and the next thing you think about is getting maybe other people out of this. Now, the exception would be, for example, soldiers in a unit, and the military works very hard to make soldiers feel like their unit is their family, and you have soldiers even sacrificing their lives for their fellows. So I think it's an interesting thing to study, and I think that to the extent that we feel bonded to our friends, our church, this probably draws on the same mechanisms, right? We feel much stronger relationship between people that we know well than people who are far from us, even though people who are far, we still often feel empathy for. Do we have time for one more question? Thank you.
Okay, you kind of touched on the answer after I stood up, but I'm a marriage and family therapy student, and my area of special interest is childhood trauma. And so I was kind of interested in how you see this study being beneficial to working with children or trauma victims in helping them to kind of reconnect,
Great
reattach.
question. So one thing we're looking at is if there is an oxytocin release deficit in these patients, whether perhaps as part of their therapy, replacing oxytocin temporarily could kind of restart the system so they can start forming these attachments. And I think, the abuse literature is very interesting because people are typically abused by someone in or close to the family, someone who should be trustworthy. So it suggests that there may be a dysfunction there.
So when you said that, were you talking about like giving them a nasal spray
Yes.
or touching them?
I mean, either. Touch for trauma patients is very sensitive. So I think, going the pharmacologic route probably is better for them. And I would think it would work short term. We've designed some studies to do this. We haven't run them yet. But something like we suggested, 2 weeks worth of once-a-day applications as part of therapy might be even enough. Now, if the receptors are permanently damaged, there's nothing you can do. But yeah, it's a question worth asking, and we should talk more if you're interested. Yes.